He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered like a benediction and a command all at once. "I have 3 moons left. Be my Luna and stay with the pack." The words broke something fierce inside her. Shards of pity, of anger, of a heat that had nothing to do with the night air. And when Mara drew a breath, she tasted iron, and the memory of a town burned to the ground. Darius's eyes were older than his face, rimmed silver like the pelt at his shoulders. And for a second she saw the valley split open behind him, and every life he had kept from breaking like glass. She felt, absurdly, like a traitor to the work she'd come to do, and like the one person in the clearing who could stop the sun from setting on him. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They were alone beneath the oak that marked the edge of the pack's old clearing, the moon a thin, precise coin above their heads. Lantern light from the lodge painted their bodies in amber. The rest of the pack slept and tucked out burrows or on the warm stones. Mara felt Cassian's gaze like a blade along her ribs. He watched from the shadow of the tree line, all lean angles and taut disdain. She registered how the betas had gathered at the lodge's edges, how the older wolves' ears were tilted forward as if to catch the sound of what might decide their future. It should have been ridiculous, an elder alpha proposing with the gravity of a treaty, but there was nothing theatrical about Darius's trembling hands or the way the moonlight seemed to tally his years into silver scars. "You shouldn't be here at all," Mara said, because words were the only scaffolding she had that night. Underneath her professional cool was blood that remembered ash. A childhood of watching wolves run the hillside before men with pitchforks and firebrands chased them away. She'd come to the Northern Valley to catalog, to examine, to write clinical notes no one else could parse. Forensics gave her distance. Up close, Darius's scent, pine sap, rain metal, old grief, unmade the distance into something like belonging she had sworn she would never want. "You shouldn't have come," Darius answered, but his voice was smaller. "I shouldn't." He stopped as if he could not bear to finish the sentence, as if the end of his summers and the cost he had kept secret until now would make her laugh him out of the clearing. When he looked at her, it was not the look of a scientist at a specimen, but of a man holding the last maps of his homeland and asking someone to trace the borders into memory. 3 moons, he repeated. That's what the healer said. 3 more full moons before the curse reaches whatever it is that kept me from dying younger. He tried to smile and failed. "Be my Luna, Mara. Stay with the pack. Let them know who will carry my name when I can't keep it safe." Her hands closed around the strap of the bag she refused to set on the ground. Inside were vials and charts and old photos of wounds that once belonged to animals, not alphas. She had trained herself on evidence, patterns of tear and tissue, of bone, not on pleas that might wreck the thin scaffolding of ethics and autonomy around her life. To accept Darius's plea would mean stepping into a role that was neither patient nor neutral. It would mean answering to a system that had killed her townspeople in the name of retribution and order. To refuse would mean leaving him to whatever fate the curse would claim. Perhaps a slow withering that would make his final moons a weapon in the mouths of rivals. "You asked me to study you, not to marry you," she said, and there was heat in her voice she didn't entirely understand. Cassian's presence made it hotter. The younger beta had expected the rule, had expected to rise by order of age and power, and his jaw was clenched like a promise. Already, Mara saw the way his supporters in the lodge shifted, how a murmur like the thrum of restrained wolves moved through them at the bare idea of Darius choosing a human, a woman they did not understand. The very idea of a Luna chosen from the species their laws forbade, of an interspecies binding, would be fuel to those who wanted the elder to step down in disgrace. "You are not naive," Darius said. For a moment, the elder's rough hands brushed the back of hers with such gentleness it hurt. "You're the only one who sees the cracks and the reason for them. You know what the curse cost me and what the peace has asked in return. I saw my wolves stop bleeding for the valley, and I paid for it alone. But I cannot be a good alpha and a dying man. I need someone who carries both." He swallowed. "You could give the pack the future of steady hands instead of a fight over what should come after me." She wanted to laugh at the phrasing, "future of steady hands," but the sound dried in her throat. The valley's politics had always been disguised as pragmatism. Who carried the bloodline? Who could hold the borders against invaders? Who could bind a fractured clan with a voice strong enough to be heard over the gods of hunger and heritage? Darius had kept it together for 40 years, his leadership stitched together with treaties and the occasional bone-deep violence. The man in front of her was not simply an alpha. He was an accumulation of all the compromises a body could hold. Loyalties, old deaths, enemies kept at bay by the weight of his name. To become his Luna would mean entering a lineage of obligation. "And if I refuse?" Her voice was steadier now, clinical, precise. She had trained herself to interrogate the living and the dead. Tonight, she applied the same method to a man with the atlas of a pack in his chest. "If I stay only as your consultant, do I get to leave? Do I keep my work, my autonomy? What happens to me when your moons run out? Will I be expected to call your successor by your name?" Darius's face softened, then hardened, as if the moonlight carved new planes into it by the second. "You would keep everything that belongs to you that I can bless." He searched her face as if trying to read a page. "But I cannot ask you to be merely a guest. This is about power, binding it so the valley doesn't tear itself apart when I go. You could be the bridge." He nearly whispered the last word, as if it were both prayer and accusation. "Mara, you have a blood in you I have not seen in other humans here. There are old lines that shift when you walk near them. If the prophecies are true, you could make what comes after me safer." She flinched. The word prophecy felt sticky with superstition and dangerous with consequence. Mara's lineage was a secret she kept like a splinter. A grandmother on her father's side who had spoken in riddles and touched wolves without flinching, who had been called a witch and given bread on certain mornings. Mara had filed anecdotes into clinical notes for years, refusing to let folklore rule the way she lived. And yet, here, beneath Darius's open, pleading face, her grandmother's words rose like heat from old coals. She had never told the pack about the times her hands had calmed a shaking hound, or how a scent could be a sentence to her. That knowledge felt like treason if she revealed it. It felt like a weapon if someone else used it. Cassian stepped from his shadow, arrogance wrapped like a cloak, and the clearing collected itself around the space he occupied. He was everything Darius had been when youth and hunger filled his limbs: quick, charismatic, raw-edged. The beta's murmur hushed when he spoke, not to Darius, but to her, the tone of a man explaining his right. "You can't bind a human to our laws, Mara. You don't know what it means, what it will cost you to be named Luna beyond the ceremony. You will be expected to bear the truce, to sign it with blood if it comes to that. If you accept our enemies at the gate." His eyes flicked to Darius like a knife to the air. "And you must know, Elder, there are wolves who'll never obey a human-born Luna." The slur came more like a gale than an insult, but there was truth in some of it. Pack law had been written with teeth and fur, and while the valley had softened in places, the core remained brutal. Mara felt the social gravity pressing on her from all sides. On one horizon, Darius's plea. On the other, Cassian's taut line of expectation. Beneath, the secret of her bloodline like a buried seam of coal. She thought of the town from which she hailed, of houses where her mother kept the shutters closed when wolves were close, of the day the border men had come with torches, and the wolves had been blamed, and the town burned. The memory made the skin at the back of her neck go cold. "Why me?" she asked finally, because it seemed the only honest question left between them. "Why not one of your own? Why call for a human when you have betas ready to step up?" Darius's eyes glinted with something that might have been shame. "Because all my betas are wolves of one kind of hunger or another," he said. "Because Cassian would bind the valley in iron and blood to win it, and because I cannot let the valley go to a hand that would break it to prove strength. And because you do not belong wholly to these hills. You are not the product of our cycles and grudges. You can be, perhaps, the shape between wars." It was both flattering and infuriating, and Mara felt the contradiction unraveling like a thread. She had come to the valley to look, to be the observer. Now she stood like a fulcrum on which the future might pivot. Around them, the pack listened with a hunger that could turn to violence. Within her, old instincts whispered of survival measured in distance and choice. To bind with Darius would be to commit to a web of obligation that could save or shackle the valley. To refuse could mean watching a leader wither, and with him, perhaps, the fragile, hard-won peace. She thought of her instruments in the bag, the small, sterile lamp that had been her talisman in operating rooms and field sites, a luminous compass she had used to hold her hands steady. She thought of the photograph tucked into the inner pocket, the remains of a dog she had once rescued from a roadside, the animal's eyes still bright in the frozen image. She had always believed that she would measure life against the worth of hands that healed. Darius's question was not about healing in the way she had trained to do. It was about stewardship, about a different calculus of what it meant to save something at the cost of changing forever. 3 moons, she repeated, tasting the sentence like a forecast. She did not answer then. Around them, the valley breathed, wolves rolling in their sleep, the distant rattle of a hunter's dream, the moon steady and indifferent. The decision hung between them like the sharp scent of a storm beginning on the horizon. Mara held the photograph until the edges blurred into the moonlight, and the paper felt more like a promise than evidence. Her silence stretched the clearing into something taut and dangerous. Even the breeze seemed to wait with bated breath. Darius watched her with an intimacy she had never asked for and could not simply refuse. Cassian's presence at the tree line was a constant sting, the rest of the pack's quiet a ledger of consequences. "You think I haven't done the math?" Mara said at last, because motion would keep her from dissolving into the risk of feeling. "You're asking me to hand you my life for 3 months, to make myself an heir to a curse you won't fully tell me, to accept someone else's battles as if they will never become mine." She wrapped the strap of her bag tighter around her shoulder, as if anchoring herself to a profession that had always let her name the terms. "This isn't a rescue. It's an exchange, and I don't know the exchange rate." Darius closed his eyes as if counting on the moon's light to do for him what his voice could not. "I will tell you everything I know," he said slowly. "I will let you see the healer's scars, the ledger of treaties, the nights I bargained with men whose teeth I taught not to gnaw on our borders." His fingers curled into the oak bark. "I cannot undo what I took to save the valley, but I can show you the truth of it. If you still walk away then, I will not follow." The gravity of that promise hit Mara like an animal, clearly stated, surprisingly honest. He would not hunt her down if she refused. Cassian's laugh was a low thing that tasted of iron and defiance. "You'd trust a dying man's truth over the counsel of those who will inherit his pack?" he asked. "We have fought, we have bled for these borders. Do you think we will hand them to a human who will one day return to her kind at the first scent of danger? You've lived with wolves only in a lab, Mara. You will learn how real they are very quickly, and what they expect." Anger flared hot in Mara, not at Cassian, but at the way he framed her as a commodity. "I grew up with wolves as they were then, raw and terrifying," she said. "I remember the night my town burned, and which faces I saw in the smoke. I don't come here with a sanctified ignorance of what you ask. I come with the memory that sometimes the wolves are the only things holding back greater mistakes." Her voice softened. "And I come because I thought my work, my forensics, would help the living and the dead by being honest. I didn't come to be handed a crown." Forensic honesty is neat until it's used to write judges' verdicts. Cassian leaned forward, the tree's shadow cutting across his cheekbones. "The pack needs a leader who can bite without blinking, who can make a hard call at dawn and still be sitting in the lodge by dusk. You think you can learn that in 3 moons? You think the pack can hold together if you take power while the valley circles the rumor of a human Luna?" Mara shot back. "Power handed to hunger-seeking teeth will only teach the valley to fear again. Isn't fear the thing that burned my town?" The words landed like stones. Some of the wolves shifted. Someone cursed softly in the back. Darius's gaze cut between Mara and Cassian like a metronome trying to keep a fragile rhythm. He opened his mouth and then shut it, as if measuring whether his voice could bend the argument back toward a place where he and the valley might survive. "You don't understand the way history eats people who try to be bridges," one of the older betas muttered, surprising everyone by stepping forward. He had more whiteness in his muzzle than black, and his eyes were the weary color of winter. "We are not children who abide by ideals. We are a valley that has learned to survive by rules. You ask us to trust a hand we rarely see, but that you say will steady us. That is a big ask, Mara." Mara looked at him and felt the weight of a generation that had learned to weather storms by calcifying its own responses. She had read generations of wounds in the bones of animals. She could see the valley's history in the way they carried their loyalties. Loyalty was not a petri dish finding she could adjust with a sterile loop. It was a living organism that had to be fed with more than promises. Yet the possibility of something new, something that might mend and not merely bind, throbbed in her like a wound that would not scab. "Tell me how the curse works," she said finally, folding herself into the only role she trusted, the investigator. "Tell me what happens to you after 3 moons if I don't bind myself to you. Tell me what the ritual does and what it asks of a Luna. Tell me what will become of the women who might follow me if I accept. Show me the ledger, Darius. Let me read the debt." Darius's lips cracked into a tired half-smile. "You always ask the right questions," he said. He called softly to someone within the lodge, and the healer, a woman wrapped in a shawl stained with herbs and old iron, came out with a leather folio. By lantern light, she laid bones and faded fabrics between them, tokens, treaty fragments, a scrap of a letter with a child's handwriting in the margins. The healer's hands trembled, but she did not falter. "The curse," Darius said, peering at the folio as if the paper contained the moon itself, "is old magic misaligned with a modern bargaining. It is not a simple death sentence. Each full moon after the healer marked me sees something leave me. Strength, memory, the ability to hold certain treaties. It accelerates wear in ways humans cannot see until the bones show it." He tapped a page where a diagram of a wolf's spine had been annotated with dates like tally marks. "I counted moons as if they were coins. Some I spent in battle, some I spent in bargains. The healer believes I have 3 coins left." The healer added, in a voice like dry leaves, Those coins are not merely your life, Darius. They are the aspect that holds the pact-making in clarity. As they dim, rival pacts sense weakness. The valley's fences fray. The old laws become easy to rewrite by force. Cassian's jaw tightened. The hunger in his eyes sharpened. So you ask a human to take what is essentially a political office with supernatural strings attached. No wonder the others murmur. His tone was venom and calculation. You want a puppet they cannot easily subvert.
It would not be puppetry, Darius said softly. It would be stewardship. Mara would stand as Luna, but she would not be a mouthpiece. She would have voice and ritual authority to steady what I leave. An authority your laws do not grant, the Elder Beta said. Once you are gone, the elders will decide. Unless an heir is named clearly in law and blood. A human will complicate that in ways some of us will not accept. Mara felt the net of the valley's customs close and then stretch. She listened to their fears. Fear of change. Fear of losing control. Fear of being ruled by someone not of their fur and fang. Fear of her. When she finally spoke, it was with the slow, cool certainty she used at autopsies, where each answer was earned by method and patience. If I agree to learn, to be Luna, I will not be a placeholder, she said. I will study every law, every treaty, every way your pack has bound itself. I will ask questions. I will refuse to sign anything I don't understand. But I will also tell you what I know about the world beyond your borders, how humans think, how hunters move, how treaties between men can break pacts faster than wars can. I will not be your savior. I may be the person who translates your terms to the world. Her fingers found Darius's hand without meaning to, and she held on not as possession, but as steadiness. But I will not accept being a named heir who answers to nothing but your old fears. If I am to stay, it will be on terms that preserve the dignity of both species. Her words landed differently than any council would have predicted. Murmurs swelled into whispered questions, into sounds that were not simply agreement or dissent, but surprise at her insistence on rights where others assumed submission. Cassian's mouth thinned, as if the wind had breathed the possibility of something beyond his control. Darius's expression softened into a fragile relief, as if he had been holding his breath and could now let some of it out.
You may not know the rituals yet, he said, but we will teach them to you as we would any Luna. You will learn the rites that bind the oath and how to call it with both voice and touch. It will be messy, and it will be dangerous. And if you still choose to walk away after you learn, I will carry that. If you stay, you will be bound by more than law. You will be bound by what we make with you. Cassian spat on the ground. You bind her with words that have teeth, he said, and the old Beta shook his head. Either this valley believes in new kinds of leadership, or it does not. This man's plea is noble because his time is short, but noble without roots in our law is a leaf that will not hold in winter. Mara tasted the metallic press of uncertainty. The idea of ritual terrified and fascinated her, of placing her hands on Darius's scarred chest and feeling not only a heart, but a map of debts. She thought of her grandmother's riddles and the way the old woman had said that some ties are not made by law, but by recognition. If the ritual could equalize power, if a Luna could share the burden, then perhaps she was not being asked to give away her autonomy, but to transform it into something shared. Teach me the rituals, she said quietly. Teach me every rationale you have for the laws and every memory that made them. Let me see the ledger. Let the pack decide with clarity whether they will accept something new. She looked to the assembled wolves, the young, the old, the ones who had watched Darius lead, and those who had bristled at his choices. If they accept me with eyes open, I will accept the work. But if they do not, then I leave, and I will tell the world what I saw." The clearing held its breath until a distant branch snapped, an insignificant sound that somehow felt like a verdict. Cassian stepped back into shadow, his posture not retreat but regrouping. The older Beta gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Darius let out a breath that sounded, for the first time since he had spoken of moons, like hope instead of plea. "Then we will begin tonight," he said. "We will begin with teaching, and with you seeing the ledger. You will drink from our histories and decide what you can bear." Mara looked at the moon as if it might weigh in on the choice. It was still thin, still a promise of what would come. She did not know yet whether accepting the lessons would bind her to a fate she regretted or open a door to a stewardship that could alter the valley's future. She only knew that every path now ran through a clearing of consequences, and that the first step was to learn the shape of the debts she might be asked to carry. Around them, the pack settled, a living audience to a drama that might make or sunder them. The night hummed with possibility and threat in equal measure, and Mara felt for the first time since the clearing had begun that wanting something could be as dangerous as refusing it. She took a breath, steady and purposeful, and stepped forward to follow Darius and the healer into the lodge where the ledger lay waiting, where histories would be read aloud, and where a woman who was more than rumor would begin to learn how to hold a wolf-made world. The lodge smelled of herbs and old leather, of boiled bones, and the smoke that clung to the rafters like slow memory. Inside, the healer spread the folio on a low table. Candles guttered and threw the pages into relief, the ink dark as dried blood. Mara followed, every step feeling like an exam taken in quickened time, each stair creak a question. The pack had closed ranks behind them, a ring of bodies and intent, leaving only the lantern-lit room and the sigh of breath. Cassian lingered at the doorway like a sentinel, unwilling to be dismissed. Darius set the folio between them with a deliberation that seemed almost ritual. His hands, those hands that had reached for treaties and broken enemies with equal measure, trembled as he smoothed the pages. The healer lit another candle and traced a finger along faded words. "The ledger is a record of bargains," she said. Her voice was a thread of ash and thyme. "It is not wholly written in ink. It is also in bone, and in the smell a wolf leaves on a marking. The curse is recorded here because men insisted on noting everything that might explain why an alpha's twilight comes early." Mara leaned in, trained eyes parsing diagrams and marginalia. The folio contained more than dates. There were scraps of binding cords, a scrap of a treaty sealed with blood, a lock of fur braided with a ribbon, charred bits of a totem, and the pressed petals of a flower known in the valley for warding. There were also, in a corner stained with something like salt, a ledger of moons, dates annotated with tiny glyphs, some circled and annotated with outcomes, a raid averted, a fire quelled, a treaty upheld. Beside each mark, someone had written a price. "What price?" Mara asked, because her words had become instruments now, and this book was a specimen begging for dissection. "The curse took something that made treaties binding," the healer said. "It hollowed out a portion of the bargain-making faculty. Each moon robbed him a sliver. The first took something small, like the knack for remembering a boarder's precise handle. The second took the steadiness of voice in counsel. The next will take the muscle memory of making bargains. At the same time, courage leaves the limbs." Darius's jaw tightened as he recited each loss like a confession. "When I first felt it begin," he said, voice low, "I thought it was age. I thought I would tire sooner, forget the names of the men who had owed me favors. Then I watched a treaty unravel because my memory of a clause had gone fuzzy. I bargained with a rival because I could no longer feel the razor between mercy and manipulation. I paid those prices thinking they were coins. Then the healer told me there was an old hedge against this magic, an old rite where a Luna could share an alpha's weight by marking their blood into the same law. Cassian's laugh was bitter, the sound of a man finding superstition a threat to his claim. So you want a human to bleed in your ledger and thus keep your power from being reopened to wolves who will use real teeth? He spat. You would make the valley dependent on a woman who might not survive the ritual and whose presence will be a provocation to every rival who learns of it. That's because you see it as sustenance, Darius said. But this is about holding a future in a way that reduces slaughter. You ask her to risk becoming less than herself, the elder Beta said, voice hoarse with history. A Luna who loses herself to protect a name becomes an instrument. Instruments are cast aside. Mara's hands were steady on the folio. The pages were brittle, and her fingertips left little crescents of dust. "Show me the ritual," she said. "Show me the markings. If there is a way to read the cost in physical terms, chemical, morphological, then I will understand better what it asks of me." She had trained to ask for mechanisms, because mechanisms could be tested, cataloged, mitigated. The healer's face, lined as it was with 1,000 domestic seasons, shifted at Mara's clinical approach. She nodded and unfolded a cloth that held a small carved bowl and a silver blade darkened with age. "These are the tools used," the healer said. "The blade draws, the bowl receives, and the weave binds. But there is also the part that cannot be seen. The alpha's burden is shared not merely by blood, but by the telling, by the Luna's voice that must turn a curse into a covenant. It is the telling that steadies it." Mara's scientific mind raged at the intangible portion. How could one measure the part that lived in story? And yet her grandmother's riddles had lives inside them that bent words into power. She was accustomed to reconciling evidence with myth. Here, that was no longer an exercise, but a negotiation of future life and identity. "How many Luna have there been?" she asked. "How many binds?" The healer's eyes darkened. "Not many," she said. "Men told us once that interspecies binds are old as the hills, but law and fear burned many of those memories out. There were 2 known Luna binds in recent memory, both fraught. One lasted but a season. The other ended in exile and a war. We have been careful." Her fingers hovered over a page where a smear had been scrubbed away. "That is why your case is dangerous." "They will use danger as reason enough to strike," Cassian said. "If a rival alpha hears the valley binds its fate to a human, he will sniff weakness. He will gather wolves who think we betrayed our nature and come down on us with fire in their jaws." At the word weakness, a ripple moved through the ring outside the lodge. Worry had become a physical thing, a tightness that threatened to bone the valley into brittle pieces. Mara felt the weight of others' fear like a weather system closing in. She could leave and publish a paper that would scandalize both species. She could flee and force Darius's hand to be taken by wolves who understood hunter as right. Or she could choose to learn the ritual, and with that, the law, so that she might wield it, not be used. "What of Cassian?" she asked slowly. "If the pack does not accept me, if he moves to take power, what will happen? Would a coup lead to blood between us that could burn valleys beyond repair?" Silence hit Darius like a winter gust. He looked at Cassian with the familiarity of decades, and the younger man's face hardened into something like a mask. "Cassian has ambition, yes," Darius said. "But he is not a monster. He believes in fire as proof of strength. If offered the chance, he might take it. He might be the change he thinks the valley needs. That is why I cannot leave things to chance."
Cassian's mouth curled. "You make me a villain," he said. "Better a villain who takes what he wants than an old man who bargains away the valley's future for the comfort of sentiment. You would rather break the valley than let it try something new," Mara said. Her words were sharp, not because she believed them without nuance, but because she needed to wedge truth into the fracture. That is not leadership. That is revenge disguised as destiny. A low growl answered, both outside and within her. For a heartbeat, every face was an animal again, coiled, ready, remembering ancient rules that had little patience for sentiment or compromise. The elder Beta who had stepped forward earlier looked at Mara with a weary softness that surprised her. "She speaks like one who has seen both sides," he said. "She has our history in her, and yet can talk of the world beyond. That is rare and dangerous in the same breath." Cassian's supporters shifted. Several wolves nearer the doorway tensed. The idea of a human Luna had become more than a rumor. It had become a decision to be made, and decisions in the valley were often answered in blood. Cassian stepped forward then, not with a howl, but with the gravity of someone who had lost patience. "If we are to be taught," he said, voice tight as wire, "then teach us truths. Let Mara learn the ledger and the law. Let her see what she asks to take on. But if we discover that her binding would leave the valley more vulnerable, I will not stand idle while our borders crumble under experiments born of sentiment." Darius's reply was a quiet thing. "Then we will do this fairly," he said. "We will let the ledger be read, the rituals shown, the costs told plainly. We will let the pack, every wolf here, decide whether to accept a human Luna who could bind or reject the attempt and choose a more traditional heir. But know this, if you choose a more traditional path out of fear rather than wisdom, you may be choosing a road that ends the peace I spent my life making." The tension in the room felt like an animal waiting to spring. Cassian's eyes flashed with wounded pride. The elder Beta's gaze was resigned. The healer's hands trembled with responsibilities older than any of them. Mara felt the ledger's weight in her lap like a small animal, alive, fragile, potentially lethal. She could still walk away that night and let the valley unravel on the old score of hunger and fear. Or she could stay and learn and risk losing what she had always intended to keep: autonomy, the life of a woman who named her terms. "You will show me everything," she said at last, "and then we will ask the pack to decide with full knowledge. If the pack chooses against me, I will leave. But if they choose for me, I will not be a puppet. I will be a steward. I will not sign away others' lives for your comfort." Cassian's exhale was like a blade dragged over leather. "Very well," he said. "Let the ledger and the law be our counsel. But do not imagine that the pack will accept poetry in place of law." Outside, a branch scraped along the window, insignificant and perfect, an ordinary sound in an evening full of storms. Inside, the folio lay open, its pages promising the same: stories and deaths, the possibility of binding and betrayal. As the healer began to read aloud the oldest entries, names of those who had once bridged species, the cost of bargains, the strange rituals that had been half-remembered and stitched back together, Mara listened as if learning a language that might save or damn her. Each sentence uncovered a splintered past, and with every fragment the fractures widened, between Darius and his betas, between hunger and stewardship, between the woman who was a scientist and the life she might be asked to become. When the reading ended, the room felt older, its architecture rearranged by the new knowledge. Outside the lodge, the pack murmured, a restless sea of lives waiting to turn a page. The choice they faced was not a single night's decision. It was an election between histories.
between the old laws written with teeth and a future that might be forged, badly or beautifully, by a human hand. Mara closed her eyes for a moment and allowed herself a private thing, a memory of smoke and the faces of those she had lost. Then she opened them and reached for the folio, as if touching the ledger might give her a map through the fractures that now split the valley. The fractures were not only in the pack. They had already begun to splinter something inside her, the patient scaffolding of her own life, the belief that work could remain separate from the heart. Secrets had been shown and would be weaponized. Loyalties would strain until some would snap. The night outside the lodge swelled with potential for violence and for repair. Mara knew, with a sharpness that slid into her bones, that the coming moons would not simply tick past. They would come bearing tests, betrayals, and choices that would define who would survive the valley and who would be remembered as a cautionary tale. In the quiet that followed the healer's reading, Cassian stood at the doorway and watched with the hard patience of one readying for conflict. Darius sat with the look of a man who had gambled away pieces of himself for something he swore was larger than his life. The pack waited like a wound to be tended or opened. Mara felt the ledger's pages warm beneath her fingers, as if some old heat remained in them, and she realized the truth she had been trying to keep at bay. Secrets could not be contained. They would fracture what they touched unless someone chose to stitch them into a new pattern. The choice, as the moon outside continued its indifferent arc, was no longer theoretical. It was a wound that would have to be either cauterized with courage or left to bleed. The lodge exploded into motion like a struck hive. A shout, Cassian's, high and sharp, sent half the ring spilling toward the doorway. Another voice, older and steady, tried to call them back. Darius moved as if pushed by wind, sudden and inhuman for a man who had been counting moons like coins. He rose and went to the window, palms flat on the sill, watching the dark tree line as if threat might be quantifiable that way. Mara's heart hammered the metronome of decisions she had promised to defer until the ledger had been read. But the valley does not wait politely for consent. It reacts. It attacks when it smells indecision. An ambush, someone outside panted, the words cutting the room open. Tracks, 2 packs, they're circling from old routes. They smelled the change. Cassian was already moving, a blade of motion. Arm yourselves. He barked orders like a man born to command, and then stalked past Darius with no deference. The lodge's ring tightened into armor, furs shifting into motion. The healer clutched the folio to her chest. "Stay here," she told Mara with a look that belied panic and hope braided together. "We bind what we can, and we will need you." Her voice betrayed that she did not know whether "we" included the world Mara inhabited or the one she was stepping into. Outside, the valley answered in thundering feet and snarls. The moon skewered shadows into knives. Rival wolves, older feuds running in their muscle memory, broke brush in the direction of the lodge. Mara found herself against a wall of fur and intent, the ledger heavy in her arms like a verdict. Darius's hand settled on her shoulder, a touch that had at times been plea and at times command. Tonight it was both warm and urgent. "I should lead," he said, breathless. "I am the Alpha, and this is my land." "You will not," Mara said before she could temper it. Her mouth startled her with its own authority. Darius looked at her with a mix of gratitude and shame. The line of his jaw tightened, then softened. "Not like this," she added. "You are not to throw away what little you have to save a moment. Let me stand in the entrance. Teach me the calls as we go. If this is the test, then we do not let fear decide who holds the door." Cassian's eyes found them both like flint. He moved to argue, and then, when he saw the steel threaded through Mara's voice, he nodded curtly. "Then teach," he snapped, "and do not let the pack be led by sentiment." They formed a line at the lodge mouth. Darius, steady despite diminishing moons. Cassian, hunger sharp as blade. Mara, a woman whose hand had only known surgical steel, and now found itself wrapped around a wooden post, knuckles whitening with the need to be useful. The world narrowed to the sound of approaching feet and the scent of strangers who had never been cousins to their valley. When the outsiders hit the clearing, they were a wild smear, black, fast, driven by the hunger of those who thought the valley's interior promised relief. They pressed, teeth bared, and for a terrifying second, it felt like the old world Mara fled, fire and blood for how one side said the other had wronged them. The first wave was chaos, flaring nostrils, flung pelts, a beta shout swallowed in the crush. A rival alpha, big enough to have once been seen as a force of nature, cut toward Darius, teeth flashing like a judgment.
Mara hurled herself forward, not with any ritual knowledge, but with the blunt, practical courage that had once dragged a dying dog from a roadside. She slammed a shoulder into the rival's flank and felt fur and breath, and the animal's startled confusion rippled down her arm. The world filled with noise, the thump of bodies, the sick, crisp sound of claws raking wood. Mara tasted copper and winter and the strain of standing at the hinge of violence. Someone, Cassian probably, saved Darius from a pounce that would have ended the elder then and there. Cassian moved with a fury that made him terrible and near perfect as a defender when he set his mind to it. He drove the rival back with teeth and force, and for a moment the pack rallied. Wolves matched wolves, old rules asserting themselves like bones knitting after breakage. Yet quantity did not always conquer quality. The rival alpha was not alone. He had packs nested at his back. And when they smelled hesitation, when they saw that the valley's heart was newly complicated by the question of binding, they pressed harder. Darius's breaths were ragged. The curse had robbed him of a certain physical endurance, and his face went pale in a way that age alone did not explain. He staggered, and Mara caught him, inexplicably steady, her hands on the leather of his coat as if it were a patient under anesthesia. "You should not," he tried to argue, but the words found no purchase in the hurricane of attack. Mara looked at him and saw the ledger inside him, pages of treaties inked with bargain and bone. She thought of the rituals the healer had shown, the bowl, the blade, the weave. She thought of the healer's phrase, that the telling steadied the burden, and felt understanding bloom like a wound healing. The Luna share was not about possession, it was about transference, about a voice that could turn the Alpha's curse into a covenant by recognizing it aloud and embodying it with shared blood. If she bound herself to Darius, she might share his curse, but perhaps she could also equalize the power, prevent rivals from reading weakness where there was careful division of authority. The rival Alpha lunged, Darius fell. The world narrowed to terrible crystalline clarity. A howl rose, a sound that was not just fury, but a question of history. And the rival Alpha's teeth touched Darius's shoulder. Mara moved before thought. She grabbed the silver blade the healer had shown her earlier, the one darkened with age, and without ceremony she drove it shallow into her own palm. Pain flared hot and immediate, and blood blossomed like a crooked star across her skin. The rival's head snapped to her. In that instant of distraction, Cassian's hand closed on its throat, and the attack splintered. Mara did not pull the blade free. She pressed her bleeding hand to Darius's chest, where the elder's pelt had been torn. Blood met blood, and the lodge filled with a sick, holy sound, as if stones themselves were swallowing the moment. The ritual words she had read hours earlier, words that had seemed like folklore, fell into her mouth as if she had known them forever. She spoke them, voice thin with shock and thick with resolve. The words were not grand, they were precise, the kind of naming that had weight only because both speaker and hearer accepted its gravity.
She named the ledger, the debt, the bargain. And where once Darius had stood alone, a space opened where two could share the null that the curse had carved. The room shuddered with a silence so complete it felt like new snow. Rival noses flared. For a breath, no one moved. Then the rival Alpha, bewildered by the sudden balance, hesitated. Wolves behind him hesitated. In those heartbeats, the valley chose. Cassian took advantage of the pause to drive the enemy back with a ferocity that was hungry and clean. Wolves bled and coughed, and the intruders fled, not because all wounds were mended, but because the pack had drawn a line and held it. Mara's palm burned like a brand. Her vision narrowed and then widened, as if the world had been tightened and then released. Where the blade had entered, something in her chest twitched, a memory, perhaps, of her grandmother's hands. The healer snatched the folio, thrust the bowl forward, and with trembling hands made the mark where Luna and Alpha bled together. The act was crude, brutal, ancient, and startlingly precise. The lodge filled with the metallic scent of shared blood and the faint, sweet smell of herbs that claimed to ward and witness. Darius's fingers closed around Mara's wrist, and for a moment the ledger was not pages but flesh and breath that both could feel. When the initial rush of battle ebbed, the lodge was messy with tired bodies and the strange hush of survival. Cassian stood at the doorway, his jacket shredded, eyes unreadable. The elder Beta moved to Darius's side with a softness he had never shown in council, and the healer bound Mara's palm with practiced care. Darius looked at Mara as if seeing her anew, not as a potential future or an argument, but as a woman who had placed herself inside the ledger with blood and breath. "You could have bled out," Darius said, voice gone thin around the edges, but full of something like reverence. "You need not have given." "I needed to know there was a way to make you less of a target," Mara answered, tired and steady. "I needed to know that if I stayed, I would not be merely an idea. I would be in the ledger." He laughed once, ragged and strange. "You've always been more of a scientist than a sacrifice," he said, "but you have done both tonight." Cassian's face shifted in a way that made Mara think the younger man had been carved and then reassembled. He moved inside, closed the door against the night, and for a dangerous moment his hand hovered near where a blade might be. He did not strike. Instead, he inclined his head toward Darius, acknowledging that power could be won by teeth or by the courage of another. "You bled for a ledger," he said finally. "No leader who could not take that as an answer would be fit to carry us." The pack's mood shifted into something that was not wholly approval or full acceptance, but the beginning of a new law. Respect bought by action, rights earned by risk. Darius reached for Mara's bandaged hand and cradled it as if it were a fragile thing he had vowed to keep. She looked at him and, for the first time since he had told her of his 3 moons, thought less of the number ticking than of the possibility she had opened with the cut. The ritual had not spared her of consequence. Her palm throbbed with something that felt like a promise and a wound. The healer muttered of precautions and watching. But in the ledger now, there was a page written in new blood. A Luna who had chosen to share the weight. That night, with wounds raw and treaties temporarily held by the need to survive, Darius and Mara stood together at the head of the lodge, not as an elder and a guest, but as 2 holders of a fragile covenant. Outside, the valley breathed. The rival packs had been repelled, for now. Cassian retreated to mend his own wounds, twisting pride into something that might, with time, become a harder kind of loyalty. In the wake of battle, old fractures had not healed. They had been cauterized by the heat of choice. Darius's moons did not shrink instantly. They were still counted, still a schedule on a ledger.
But one of the moons had been bought, not by old bargains, but by a human's willingness to share a name and a wound. Mara sat with her palm bandaged and felt an odd new steadiness in her chest.
She had expected the ritual to take her away from herself. Instead, it had made her a translation between histories. She had not surrendered autonomy so much as transformed it into a shared authority, a dangerous, living thing that could be wielded or mishandled. Darius's hand found hers again, whether for thanks or claim she could not tell. He looked at her with an astonishment that made him seem both younger and immediately older. "You left me breathless," he said simply, voice raw with something like gratitude, surprise, and something softer. Mara smiled despite the ache. "You left me less indifferent to what a pack is," she answered. "We have a long ledger to make sense of." They bled together into the night, not finishing cures, but beginning a repair. Cassian would have to find his place, either tempered by the sight of what true stewardship required, or hardened into exile. The valley had been saved from one night's invasion by an impossible, improvised covenant. The coming moons would still test them. Rivals would probe, politics would fester, but they had, in the furnace of attack, staked a new claim. A Luna who had bound herself with blood to an elder, and, in doing so, had remade what it meant to inherit a pack. When dawn came, thin and stubborn, the lodge smelled of smoke and resin and the bitter tang of blood. The ledger lay open on the table, pages rumpled but present. Mara rose slowly, palm throbbing, and, behind the pain, felt the ledger's new heat like a pulse. She had traded a sterile certainty for something dangerous and luminous. Darius watched her with an awe that made him seem less like a man who had 3 moons left and more like one who had been given a reason to count them differently. Outside, the valley moved as if the act of surviving had rewritten its grammar. The fractures would still have to be mended, relations with rival packs, the question of law in the face of a human Luna, Cassian's pride. But tonight had changed the ledger's most crucial line, the one that read who would bear the valley's burdens. Mara had stepped into that line with blood on her palm and resolve in her voice. She had not surrendered herself. She had become a part of the ledger by her own measure. Darius, who had once asked her to be his Luna as a plea against time, now watched her and did not speak of moons. He watched her with the weight of a future he had not expected to see. And Mara, feeling oddly like an heir and not like caged property, met his gaze. The lodge was a riot of low conversations and quiet repairs. Outside, the valley dawned. Between them, a new covenant drew its first uncertain breath, fragile and fierce as a newborn thing. The valley settled into a brittle peace that felt, for now, like a promise under repair. Days moved with the awkward rhythm of people learning new steps. Wolves checking treaty pages with noses and cautious eyes, betas arguing clauses as if law could be muscle memory, and hunters from the border listening for rumor and hearing instead the steady scrape of a ledger being rewritten. Cassian kept his distance at first, tending scars and pride in equal measure. He watched Mara as if measuring a tool he might one day need. Sometimes his look softened into something like respect. Other nights it sharpened into a danger she would not pretend to have neutralized. He did not leave the valley. Instead, he stayed and let his hunger be tempered by the sight of a Luna who had bled for a choice rather than taken by teeth. Darius's moons continued to thin, each full circle a reminder of the bargain that had been struck and the debts still owed. But something in him had altered. The way he sat at council, the way his laughter came easier at the edges of night, the way his hand reached without pleading when Mara stood near. He was still the elder who had kept borders with treaties and violence, but now he carried a softness that fear could not fully erode, an acceptance that stewardship could be shared and that legacy might be stewarded rather than seized. Mara learned rituals as if learning a language of scars and stitches. She read the ledger until ink and memory blurred. She walked the borders with betas and the old men who had once taught Darius the bargain. She kept her forensics kit in a small trunk by the lodge door, a reminder of the life she had not abandoned but had folded into this new shape. Autonomy returned, redefined. She had not been claimed so much as chosen, and then chosen again by a pack learning to balance old law with new truth. Rival packs sniffed and tested the valley's edges in the months that followed. Some threats dissolved at sight of the shared blood mark. Others forced councils, sacrifices, and nights when every eye stayed wakeful. The ledger grew thicker, not only with treaties, but with names of those who had bridged species in small, stubborn acts of care. Children, wolf and human-sired, learned both tongues, the human one of speech and the lupine one of scent. On a late morning, when the air tasted like thaw and resin, Mara and Darius walked the ridge that looked down on the valley he had kept. He moved slower now, but his hand found hers as if to measure steadiness, not to claim it. They did not speak of moons. Instead, they counted fences mended and fields saved, the slow accrual of days that mattered more than any single night. When he stopped, he looked at her with an expression that was equal parts wonder and relief. "You stayed," he said, simply. "I stayed," she answered, and the word held the weight of all she had traded and earned. She rested her head briefly against his chest, feeling treaty and heartbeat sink into a new rhythm. Around them, the valley breathed, wary, watchful, and, beneath the scars, alive. The final image was not of endings, but of a horizon, a thin moon receding and a thicker one waiting, two orbs like a pair of held promises. They watched it together, hands joined, ledger between them, and for the first time the counting of moons was no longer a sentence, but a story they would write together.